Prepare to immerse yourself in a tale that defies reason and reveals the darkest side of human nature. Today we'll journey through the dark Appalachian mountains, where the law barely reached, and where two brothers built such a terrible reputation that their names were deliberately erased from official records. Comment below where you're watching and if you've heard of this story that time tried to bury. It was the late 18th century, a time when the borders of the United States were still nebulous and dangerous. The Appalachian Mountains stretched as a natural barrier between coastal civilization and the unexplored West. It was a region of dense forests, deep valleys, and isolated communities where entire families could live for months without seeing a stranger. In this setting of isolation and self-sufficiency, Elias and Silas were born, twin brothers who would reach 19 years of age, carrying secrets that no history book dared to fully document. The region where our story unfolds is in the mountains of eastern Tennessee, near the North Carolina border. This is rugged territory, covered in centuries-old pines and oaks, crisscrossed by icy streams that flowed from rocky outcrops. Trails were few and poorly marked. Roads were little more than dirt tracks that turned to mud in spring and froze in winter. Here, survival depended on hunting, subsistence farming, and occasional trade with travelers who dared to cross the mountains. The brothers were born in a log cabin nestled in a remote valley, far from any settlement. Their father was known by the local community as a man with a difficult temperament, a skilled hunter, but a man of few words. Their mother had died when the boys were still young, leaving them in the care of a man who could barely care for himself. They grew up virtually alone, learning to hunt, track animals, and survive in the harshest conditions. From an early age, they developed a strange, almost telepathic connection. Close neighbors said the two seemed to share thoughts, that one always knew where the other was, even separated by miles of dense forest. By the time they turned 19, Elias and Silas were already known in the region as troubled young men. Tall, broad-shouldered, and with dark hair that fell to their shoulders, they had an unsettling appearance. Their eyes were described as vacant, expressionless, as if they were always calculating something. They wore tanned leather clothes, worn boots, and carried long knives strapped to their belts. They rarely spoke to anyone. Strangers, and when they did, they used few words, always enigmatic. Their names first appeared in local records in a complaint filed by a trader traveling through the mountains toward the town of Jonesboro, Tennessee. The man reported being approached by the brothers on a narrow trail near a canyon. They didn't ask for anything, just blocked the path and watched. The trader felt fear, saying there was something wrong with those two, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. He detoured onto an alternate trail and continued on his way, but the feeling of being watched stayed with him for miles. A few months later, a couple of settlers who had just settled on a farm near the valley disappeared. They had gone out one morning to check traps in a wooded area about 2 miles from their property and never returned. Neighbors organized searches, hiked trails, and searched ravines, but found no trace. It was as if the two had been swallowed by the mountain. Weeks passed. The settlers' cabin was found intact, with their belongings still in place, food stored, and tools organized. Everything indicated they intended to return. Then rumors began to spread. A hunter, familiar with the area, claimed to have seen smoke rising from a remote area of the mountains, where there were no known cabins. Another man swore he heard muffled screams echoing through the valley on a full moon night. People began to whisper about the brothers. Someone recalled that Elias and Silas had been seen near the missing couple's farm a few days before their disappearance, but no one had any proof. At that time, with no body, no direct witnesses, and no effective legal authority in the region, there was no way to file formal charges. What made it all even more disturbing was the geography of the place. The Appalachian Mountains at that time were a natural labyrinth. There were deep caves, rocky crevices, and areas of forest so dense that sunlight barely penetrated. A body could disappear there and never be found. Wild animals would do the rest. Bears, wolves, coyotes, all abundant in the region. Nature was relentless and efficient at covering its tracks. Official records from Washington County, where much of this territory lay, reveal a series of unexplained disappearances between 1795 and 1800. Travelers, traders, entire families attempting to cross the mountains. Some were found days later, lost but alive. Others were simply never seen again. And always, between the lines of the accounts, in the fragmented testimonies stored in dusty archives, there appeared mention of two brothers who lived in isolation, who knew every trail, every cave, every hiding place in the mountains. The territory was too vast for any kind of effective surveillance. There weren't enough sheriffs. There were no organized patrols. Law enforcement, when it arrived, came too late and without resources. Communities depended on informal justice, on mutual protection among neighbors. But what to do when the threat knew the terrain better than anyone? When the suspects were ghosts who appeared and disappeared among the pines as if they were part of the forest itself? The brothers' reputation began to spread through nearby villages and towns. In dimly lit taverns around campfires, in churches after Sunday services, people exchanged stories. Some were clearly exaggerated, born of fear and superstition. Others held a ring of truth that chilled the blood. There were reports from travelers who had seen the two watching from afar, standing like statues among the trees. Others spoke of strange footprints found near places where people had disappeared. And there were those who swore they heard peculiar whistles echoing through the forest, a code the brothers used to communicate over distances. The winter of 1797 was particularly harsh in that region. Snow blanketed the mountains for weeks, further isolating the communities scattered throughout the valleys. It was during this period that 3 fur trappers decided to explore a less frequented area farther north, where beaver and fox were said to be abundant. They set out in early December, carrying 2 weeks' worth of supplies. None of them returned. When spring melted the snow, a search party found the remains of an abandoned camp, but no sign of the men. Their weapons, their tools, everything was gone. Only the cold ashes of a campfire and a few half-faded footprints that led nowhere. The months following that brutal winter brought palpable tension to Appalachian communities. Families began locking their doors more carefully, even in broad daylight. Men began traveling in groups, never alone, and everyone avoided certain trails, certain valleys, certain areas of the forest where the sense of danger seemed to emanate from the trees themselves. But the silence from the authorities was deafening. There were no formal investigations, no organized searches by the territorial government. The stark truth was that these mountains lay in a gray area of jurisdiction, where Tennessee was still struggling to establish order, and North Carolina had already lost control. It was during this period that the figure of Samuel Garrett emerged, a man who would be crucial to our understanding of the events. Garrett was a respected merchant from Jonesboro, one of the few settlements beginning to gain a semblance of civilization in that wilderness. He kept a meticulous journal of his travels through the mountains, recording routes, weather conditions, commodity prices, and, most importantly for us, observations about the people he encountered along the way. His journal, now kept in the Tennessee Historical Archives, contains some of the most detailed descriptions we have of Elijah and Silas. In an entry dated April 1798, Garrett describes a disturbing encounter. He was returning from a business trip when he decided to camp in a clearing near a creek, about 10 miles south of Jonesboro. It was late afternoon, the sun beginning to sink behind the distant peaks. He had just started a fire when he noticed 2 figures watching from the edge of the woods. At first he thought they were deer, but then the figures moved, and he recognized human forms. It was the brothers. Garrett wrote that his blood ran cold. They didn't approach, didn't say anything. They simply stood there, motionless, watching. He estimated they remained that way for at least half an hour, maybe more. The trader couldn't eat, couldn't relax. He kept his hand on his rifle the entire time. Then, without warning, without a sound, the 2 of them disappeared. It was as if they had been absorbed by the gathering darkness. Garrett spent the night awake, feeding the fire, listening for any sound. In the morning, when he finally managed to leave, he found footprints all around his camp. They had circled his perimeter several times during the night, making no sound that he could detect. This type of behavior would become the brothers' trademark. They didn't attack openly. They didn't make direct threats. Instead, they created a climate of psychological terror. Travelers reported being followed for miles, always feeling eyes on their backs but never able to confirm anyone's presence. Others would wake in the middle of the night to find objects in their camp rearranged, as if invisible hands had moved everything while they slept. It was a way of demonstrating power, of showing that they could get close whenever they wanted, that nothing was beyond their reach. But there were also more serious cases, those that could not be explained as mere intimidation. In the summer of that same year, a family of settlers who had settled in a secluded valley were found dead in their own cabin, the father, mother, and an adult brother. The scene was disconcerting. There were no signs of a struggle, no disorder. The bodies were simply arranged as if they were sleeping, but the cause of death was a mystery. There were no visible injuries, no marks of violence. It was as if the life had been drained from them overnight. The traveling doctor who examined the bodies was perplexed. He had never seen anything like it. He speculated about poisons, about unknown diseases, but nothing fully explained what had happened. The local community, however, had its own theories. They said the brothers knew of poisonous plants that grew deep in the forest, herbs that Native Americans used in secret rituals. They said Elijah and Silas had learned ancient techniques from an old hunter who had lived among the Cherokee tribes before they were driven from the region. No one could prove anything, but suspicions were strong enough that a group of men decided to take action. A sort of informal militia was organized, about 20 men armed with muskets, rifles, and knives. They set out one August morning, determined to find the brothers' cabin and confront them directly. The plan was simple: take them to Jonesboro, where they would be questioned about the disappearances and suspicious deaths. If they resisted, they would be restrained by force. It was frontier justice, harsh and direct, the only form of law that worked in that time and place. But finding the brothers would be more difficult than anyone imagined. The militia spent 3 days scouring the mountains, following trails that led nowhere, exploring valleys where sunlight barely penetrated. They found traces of old camps, the remains of fires that had been extinguished for weeks, animal bones scattered in strange patterns as if deliberately arranged, but no sign of the brothers themselves. On the 3rd day, something changed. The militiamen began to feel like they were being watched. It was a sensation difficult to describe, but everyone shared it. The forest grew incredibly silent. The birds stopped singing. Even the wind seemed to have died down. And then the whistling began. High-pitched, distant sounds, coming from different directions, seemed to move around the group. The men tried to locate the source, but it was impossible. The whistling echoed off the rocks, mixing with the natural sounds of the forest, creating a disorienting cacophony. One of the men, an experienced hunter named Thomas McBride, recognized the pattern. He had been a tracker during the Revolutionary War and was familiar with guerrilla tactics. The brothers were communicating positions, coordinating movements. They weren't running away. They were surrounding the militia. McBride alerted the others, and the group quickly formed a defensive circle, all back to back, guns trained on the surrounding woods. The silence that followed was oppressive. Minutes dragged on like hours. No one dared speak. All eyes scanned the trees, the bushes, the shadows between the trunks. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the tension dissipated. The birds began to sing again. A gentle breeze stirred the leaves. The forest returned to normal. The brothers had disappeared again, like smoke dispersing into the air. The militia returned to Jonesboro defeated and distraught. They had been outmatched on their own turf, humiliated by 2 men who knew those mountains like no one else. The message was clear. The brothers were untouchable. They controlled that territory, and no improvised force of settlers could change it. From that moment on, the attitude of the local communities changed. Instead of confrontation, there was resignation. People learned to live with the threat, to avoid certain areas, to travel only on the busiest routes. But the disappearances didn't stop. If anything, they became more frequent. Between 1798 and 1800, Washington County's fragmented records list at least 12 people who vanished without a trace in that region. 12 lives that simply vanished, swallowed by the dark green immensity of the Appalachians, and in each case there were whispers of 2 dark-haired brothers who prowled the trails like patient predators. What was really happening in those mountains? What was the true purpose behind these acts? And most importantly, how far did Elijah and Silas's crimes extend? The answers to these questions would remain buried for a long time, protected by the silence of the witnesses, the vastness of the territory, and the authorities' inability to impose order in a land where law was more a suggestion than a reality. The year 1800 brought significant changes to the Tennessee Territory. The federal government began pushing for a more efficient administrative organization, and new counties were being formed in the mountainous regions. With this, official positions emerged that had not previously existed: justices of the peace, constables, land registrars. It was the beginning of an attempt to bring civilization to an area that for decades had operated under its own rules. And with this new structure, someone finally began to pay attention to the disturbing patterns occurring in the eastern mountains. That someone was Jonathan Whitfield, a newly appointed magistrate for Sullivan County, a jurisdiction that encompassed a significant portion of the region where the brothers operated. Whitfield was originally from Virginia, an educated man who had studied law in Richmond and brought with him ideas about order and justice that contrasted sharply with the brutal reality of the frontier. He arrived in Blountville, the county seat, in the early spring of 1800, filled with determination to make a difference. One of the first things Whitfield did was request all existing records of unsolved crimes in the area. What he found deeply disturbed him. There was an unusual concentration of disappearances in a specific stretch of the mountains, always along the same routes, always in remote areas where help would take days to arrive. He began mapping the incidents, marking dates and locations on a large map he hung in his office, and a pattern emerged. The disappearances occurred in waves. There would be 3 or 4 cases concentrated in a few months, then a lull that could last half a year or more, and then another wave would begin. It was as if there was an intelligence behind the events, someone who knew when to back off, when to remain quiet until the attention dissipated. Whitfield also noticed that the victims had similar profiles. They were always lone travelers or small groups, never large caravans. These were people who wouldn't be immediately searched for, whose absences could go unnoticed for weeks. The magistrate began asking questions. He traveled through isolated villages and farms, speaking with hunters, traders, and settler families, and in almost every conversation, after some prodding, the names would come up: Elias and Silas. Always spoken in hushed tones, always accompanied by nervous glances. People were afraid to speak openly about the brothers, as if pronouncing their names might summon them, but Whitfield was persistent, and little by little he began to piece together a frightening picture. He discovered that the brothers didn't live in a single fixed hut. Instead, they maintained several camps scattered throughout the mountains, constantly shifting locations. They were nomadic within their own territory, impossible to track. He also learned that they occasionally appeared in small settlements to trade furs and game for basic supplies: salt, gunpowder, new knives. On these occasions they behaved strangely normally, almost politely, completing their transactions quickly and leaving without causing trouble. It was as if they had 2 completely different personalities. Whitfield decided he needed to speak to someone who had interacted directly with the brothers and survived to tell the story. That's how he found Rebecca Thornton, a woman in her 30s who ran a small grocery store at a major trail junction. Rebecca was known for her courage and insight. She had inherited the business from her late husband and ran it alone, serving travelers and locals alike. Rebecca told Whitfield that the brothers would show up at her store every few months. They always arrived at dusk when there were fewer people around. They never went in together. One would stand outside watching while the other shopped. They paid in silver coins, never owed anything, never caused trouble. But there was something about them that made her deeply uncomfortable. Their eyes, she said. It was as if they were assessing everything and everyone, calculating vulnerabilities, searching for weaknesses. She also mentioned something Whitfield found particularly interesting. The brothers always bought the same things: salt in large quantities, far more than 2 people would need to preserve normal game meat, gunpowder and lead for ammunition, knives and cutting tools, and rope. They always bought thick, sturdy rope. When Rebecca once asked what they needed so much rope for, Silas simply smiled and said it was for setting traps, but the smile didn't reach his eyes, and Rebecca never asked again. Armed with this information, Whitfield began formulating a plan. He couldn't simply send men to hunt the brothers in the mountains. The experience of the failed militia had proven that futile. He needed a different, more patient approach. He decided he would wait until the brothers appeared again in one of the villages to make purchases, and then trap them in open terrain, where they would have no tactical advantage. But before he could put his plan into action, something happened that would change everything. In the summer of 1801, a group of explorers hired by North Carolina land speculators entered the mountains to map out potential expansion areas. They were 5 experienced men, all veterans of previous expeditions. They carried measuring equipment, maps, and a month's worth of supplies. They were expected to return in early August. August came and went. September, too. There was no sign of the explorers. Families began pressing for searches, but the territory was vast, and no one knew exactly which route they had taken. It wasn't until October, when the first frosts began to cover the mountains, that a hunter stumbled upon something disturbing in a remote area near the Watauga River. He found the remains of an abandoned camp. Equipment was scattered, maps were torn, and measuring instruments were broken. But most disconcerting were the signs of a struggle. The surrounding vegetation was trampled, branches were broken, and deep marks were visible in the ground as if something heavy had been dragged. The hunter, fearing the worst, followed the drag marks for about 50 meters to the edge of a deep ravine. He peered down into the darkness of the rocky crevice and decided he wouldn't go down alone. When Whitfield learned of the discovery, he immediately organized an official search expedition. 15 men, including the magistrate himself, set out for the site. What they found in the ravine confirmed their worst fears. At the bottom of the crevice, partially covered by leaves and twigs, lay remains belonging to the explorers. The scene was too disturbing to document fully, but Whitfield took careful notes of what could be observed without disrespecting the deceased. What became clear was that this had not been an accident. There was evidence that the men had been brought there and then discarded. Some of their belongings were found scattered throughout the area, but other valuable items were completely gone. Their weapons, for example. None of the 5 firearms the explorers had carried were found. Also missing were all the quality metal tools, the ropes and, curiously, all the maps that weren't torn. Whitfield was convinced he finally had concrete evidence to act on. He drew up formal warrants for the arrest of Elias and Silas, charging them with multiple murders and robberies. He distributed copies of these warrants to all the constables in the region, offering a substantial reward of $100 in silver to whoever captured the brothers alive. This was a considerable sum at the time, enough to buy a small farm. Word of the reward spread quickly throughout the mountains. Suddenly, bounty hunters were arriving from other regions. Tough, experienced men, lured by the promise of easy money. They didn't know the brothers' reputation. They didn't understand the terrain. They didn't know what they were getting into. And this would lead to more tragedies. The arrival of the bounty hunters brought a different energy to the region. These men came from places like Kentucky, Virginia, and even Pennsylvania, lured by the promise of $100 in silver. Many of them had hunted fugitives before, tracking horse thieves and deserters through hostile territory. But the Appalachian Mountains presented challenges few of them had faced before, and the brothers they sought were unlike any quarry they had ever pursued. The first group to try their luck consisted of 3 men from Kentucky. They arrived in Jonesboro in late October 1801, equipped with good rifles, sturdy horses, and a confidence bordering on arrogance. They told Magistrate Whitfield they would be back in 2 weeks at the most, with the brothers bound and ready for trial. Whitfield tried to warn them about the treacherous nature of the terrain and the cunning of their targets, but his warnings were met with condescending smiles. They were professionals, they claimed, and had handled much more difficult cases. 2 weeks passed. No sign of the bounty hunters. 3 weeks, a month. Eventually, their horses were found roaming loose in a natural pasture about 20 kilometers north of where they had last been seen. Their saddles were intact. Their saddlebags still contained supplies. But of the men themselves there was no trace. It was as if they had simply dismounted and walked into the forest, disappearing forever. This pattern would repeat itself repeatedly over the following months. Bounty hunters would arrive confidently, head deep into the mountains and never be seen again. Some left clues to their destination, abandoned camps, lost equipment. Others simply vanished without leaving anything behind. The bounty, rather than solving the problem, was creating new victims. Whitfield was so disturbed by the situation that he considered cancelling the offer, but then he feared doing so would be interpreted as weakness, as an admission that the brothers were truly untouchable. Meanwhile, tales of Elijah and Silas began to take on almost mythical overtones. They said they could move through the forests without making a sound, that they could disappear in plain sight, that they had the ability to predict when someone was hunting them. Some claimed the brothers had made pacts with dark forces that inhabited the depths of the mountains, that they were protected by ancient spirits. Obviously, many of these stories were the product of fear and superstition, but they served to amplify the terror the brothers inspired. There were, however, elements of truth behind some of these legends. The brothers did possess extraordinary survival and tracking skills. They knew every cave, every secret trail, every water source in the mountains. They could read signs in the forest that other men would miss. They partially erased footprint, a twig broken in a specific way, the behavior of birds. All of these gave them information about who was moving through their territory. and they used this knowledge with lethal efficiency. In the winter of 1802, something happened that would reveal a little more about the brothers' true nature. A fur trader named Dutch Wagner, who had a reputation for being extremely cautious and experienced in the mountains, returned from a trip with a disturbing story. He was camped in a cave during a particularly severe blizzard when he heard voices outside. He immediately extinguished his fire and hid in the cave's deepest shadows, watching. Two figures appeared in the entrance, shaking snow from their clothes. It was Elias and Silas. They didn't know Wagner was there, hidden a few feet away. The brothers lit a small fire and began talking as they waited for the storm to pass. Wagner, barely daring to breathe, heard fragments of their conversation. They talked about routes, about timetables, about when it would be safe to move again. They mentioned specific places in the mountains using names Wagner had never heard, as if they had their own secret geography. But what disturbed him most was the tone of the conversation. There was no emotion in their voices. They talked about their activities the way a farmer might talk about planting corn or mending a fence. It was work, routine, something done efficiently and without moral reflection. Wagner realized he was in the presence of something profoundly wrong, of two minds operating at different frequencies from the rest of humanity. He remained hidden for hours, while the storm raged outside and the brothers rested by the fire. At one point, Silas got up and walked toward the area where Wagner was hiding. The merchant thought he had been discovered, that his last moment had come. But Silas simply scooped up some snow that had accumulated near the cave wall and returned to the fire. It was pure luck that he didn't look a few feet deeper into the darkness. When dawn broke and the storm subsided, the brothers set off without ever noticing Wagner's presence. He waited a full hour before moving, shivering not only from the cold, but also from fear. When he finally left the cave and headed for the nearest village, he swore he would never return to that part of the mountains, and he kept that promise. Wagner's story circulated among traders and hunters, and it had a significant impact. People began to understand that the brothers were not just common criminals. There was a coldness about them, a lack of basic humanity that made them different and far more dangerous. It wasn't anger that motivated them, nor uncontrolled greed. It was something more calculated, more systematic. They had transformed human predation into a way of life. Whitfield, upon hearing Wagner's account, realized he was dealing with a much larger problem than he had initially imagined. He wrote letters to authorities in other regions asking for assistance, suggesting that an organized military force would be necessary to deal with the situation. But his letters received lukewarm responses. The federal government was busy with bigger issues, treaties with European nations, territorial disputes with foreign powers. Two criminals in the Tennessee mountains were not a priority, so Whitfield decided to change strategy. If he couldn't capture the brothers, perhaps he could isolate them, cutting off their access to supplies. He began visiting all the merchants in the area, urging them to refuse to sell anything to Elijah and Silas. Some agreed immediately, happy to have an official excuse to keep the two away from their establishments. Others hesitated, fearing retaliation. But eventually most agreed to cooperate. The plan made some sense. Without access to gunpowder, salt, and other basic necessities, the brothers would be forced to leave their territory or take greater risks to obtain what they needed. And when they took these risks, they could be captured. It was a siege strategy, slow but potentially effective. For a few months it seemed to work. There were no new disappearances, no reports of encounters with the brothers. The mountains fell eerily silent. Whitfield began to believe they might have migrated to another region, or even that something had happened to them. But he was wrong. What was really happening was that the brothers had simply adapted. They began obtaining supplies in other ways, likely by attacking small groups of travelers more frequently, taking what they needed directly from the victims, and they waited, patient as ever, for the right moment to demonstrate that they still controlled the territory. That moment would come in the spring of 1803, in a way no one could have predicted. Spring in 1803 arrived late that year. Snow lingered in the higher elevations until late April, and streams ran swollen with meltwater. It was a time of rebirth in the mountains, when life returned after the icy silence of winter. But for the communities scattered throughout the valleys, that spring brought not renewal, but a brutal reminder that the threat looming over them had never disappeared. In early May, a caravan of families traveling from eastern North Carolina toward the new settlements in Tennessee decided to take a lesser-known route through the mountains. There were 3 families in total. about 15 people including adults, and 11 ox-drawn wagons. They had been advised to follow the main trail further south, but the group's leader, a man named Henry Caldwell, was stubborn and believed he knew a shortcut that would save at least 5 days of travel. Caldwell's decision would take them directly through the territory where the brothers operated. The first few days of travel were uneventful. The weather was favorable, the animals behaved well, and the group made steady progress. They camped in open clearings, maintained large fires at night, and followed all the basic precautions experienced travelers take. But on the 4th night, something changed. It was William Sutton, one of the men in the caravan keeping the night watch, who first noticed. He was sitting near the central fire, his rifle resting on his knees, when he realized that the surrounding forest had gone completely silent. No crickets, no owls, not even the whisper of small nocturnal animals, just a heavy, unnatural silence. Sutton stood up, every instinct screaming that something was wrong. He woke Caldwell and the other men discreetly, without alarming the sleeping people. 6 armed men formed a perimeter around the camp, all alert, watching the shadows between the trees. They remained like that until dawn, seeing nothing, hearing nothing, but the feeling of being watched never left them. When the sun finally rose, they found footprints all around the camp, boot prints circling the entire area. Someone had been there during the night, moving silently while everyone slept. Caldwell decided to pick up the pace. They needed to get out of this region as quickly as possible. The wagons were prepared with unusual haste, and the caravan set off before the dew had even completely dried. But speeding a caravan of heavy wagons through rugged mountain trails was easier said than done. Progress remained slow, and the sense of danger only grew. On the 2nd day after the nighttime incident, one of the wagons broke an axle while traveling over a particularly difficult section of trail. It was a serious problem that would take hours to repair. Caldwell had no choice but to stop and make the repairs. While some men worked on the wagon, others stood guard, and the rest of the group tried to maintain some semblance of normality, preparing meals and caring for the animals. It was during this vulnerable period that the brothers chose to appear. They didn't attack. They didn't threaten openly. They simply appeared at the edge of the woods, about 50 yards from the camp, and stood there watching. Caldwell and his men immediately drew their weapons but didn't fire. There was no legal justification for shooting someone who was merely observing, even if their presence was deeply disturbing. The brothers remained there for perhaps 20 minutes. They didn't speak, didn't move, just watched with those empty eyes so many had described. Then, as suddenly as they had appeared, they disappeared back into the forest. The psychological effect was devastating. The people in the caravan were terrified. Some wanted to abandon their wagons and try to follow the main trail on foot, even if it meant leaving all their belongings behind. Others insisted on continuing as quickly as possible along their chosen route. Caldwell, trying to keep the group together, decided they would continue, but with extra precautions. Repairs to the wagon were hastily completed, and the caravan resumed its journey. They traveled well past dark, something normally avoided, but fear drove them on. When they finally stopped to camp, it was in a relatively open area where it would be difficult for anyone to approach unseen. That night, no one slept soundly. The watches were doubled, with 4 men always awake and alert. The campfires were kept large and bright. The weapons were left loaded and within easy reach. And yet, in the morning, they discovered that some of the supplies were missing. Sacks of flour, strips of dried meat, a small box of ammunition. Someone had entered the camp during the night and taken what they wanted, without any of the watchmen noticing. The terror that gripped the group after this discovery was palpable. If the intruders could come and go at will, taking whatever they wanted, what was to stop them from doing something far worse? People began to question every shadow, every sound. Confidence in the group's safety was completely shattered. Caldwell decided to send 2 horsemen ahead to try to reach the nearest settlement and bring help. William Sutton and another man named James McCreary volunteered. They set out at dawn, mounted on the caravan's best horses, with orders to ride non-stop until they reached civilization. The hope was that they could bring a rescue force before something terrible happened. The 2 men never reached the village. Their horses were found 3 days later by a hunter, wandering loose near the Holston River. The saddles showed signs of a struggle, and there was dried blood on the leather, but there was no trace of the riders themselves. News of their disappearance reached the authorities before the caravan itself had made it out of the mountains. Meanwhile, the remaining group continued their desperate journey. They had abandoned one of the damaged wagons, distributing its load among the others to gain speed. They were exhausted, their nerves frayed, but they kept moving forward, knowing that stopping could be fatal. The brothers continued to appear sporadically, always at a distance, always watching, like predators assessing wounded prey. It was on the 6th day after entering that cursed region that the caravan finally reached a point where the trail widened and began to descend toward lower ground. In the distance, they could see the smoke from the chimneys of a small village. Salvation was in sight. The relief was so great that some people began to weep openly, but the brothers weren't finished yet. On the last night before reaching the village, when the group camped in an area already partially within cultivated land, there was a final encounter. The brothers appeared again, but this time they approached closer, reaching the edge of the circle of light from the fires. Caldwell and his men raised their weapons, ready to fire if necessary. Silas, or maybe it was Elias, it was hard to tell them apart even up close, spoke. His voice was surprisingly calm, almost soft. He said only one thing in perfectly clear English: "You're lucky this time. Keep walking and don't look back." And then, as always, the two of them disappeared into the darkness. The caravan reached the village the next morning. They were traumatized, exhausted but alive. Caldwell immediately reported everything to the local constable, who in turn sent an urgent message to Magistrate Whitfield. For the first time, there were multiple reliable witnesses who could attest not only to the brothers' existence, but also to their specific actions, their methods of intimidation, and the disappearance of Sutton and McCreary. Whitfield realized he had an opportunity. With so many witnesses and fresh evidence, he might finally be able to build a solid case and a successful capture operation. But he also knew he would need more than a few local constables. He would need a real, disciplined and well-equipped force, and achieving that would require convincing reluctant authorities that the threat was significant enough to warrant significant resources. The arrival of the traumatized caravan in the village and the detailed testimonies about the terror in the mountains finally gave Whitfield the political ammunition he needed. He compiled all the accounts into a lengthy document, enclosed maps showing the patterns of disappearances, and sent copies to the governor of Tennessee, federal judges, and even military authorities in Knoxville. His message was clear. The eastern mountains had become a lawless territory, controlled by criminals operating with absolute impunity, and this posed a threat not only to the local residents, but to anyone attempting to cross the region. The answer came faster than he expected. The governor, concerned about the territory's reputation and eager to attract more settlers, authorized the formation of an official militia, funded by the territorial government. It would be commanded by a captain named Marcus Brennan, a veteran of wars against Native American tribes in the South, a man known for his brutal efficiency and his impatient treatment of those who challenged established authority. Brennan arrived in Jonesboro in June 1803 with 20 men under his command. These were seasoned soldiers, not improvised farmers with old muskets. They carried modern rifles, wore proper uniforms, and followed military discipline. Brennan spent a full week listening to testimonies, studying maps, and familiarizing himself with the territory. He spoke at length with Caldwell and the survivors of the caravan, extracting every detail they could remember about the brothers and their tactics. What impressed Brennan most was the coordination between Elias and Silas, the way they communicated through whistles, how they always seemed to know where the other was, how they worked together to surround and intimidate their victims. He recognized military tactics here, not the chaotic behavior of common criminals. Someone had trained these two, or they had developed a sophisticated understanding of strategy and combat on their own. Brennan decided not to attempt to hunt the brothers directly in the mountains. That would be playing by their rules in terrain they knew perfectly. Instead, he would establish a permanent presence in the region, regular patrols on the main trails, observation posts at strategic points. He would turn the mountains into a prison for the brothers, gradually tightening the siege until they had no more room to operate. The strategy began to be implemented in late June. Small detachments were positioned at key locations, constructing fortified huts that would serve as bases of operation. Patrols began traveling the trails at irregular times, never following predictable patterns. Brennan wanted the brothers to know they were being watched, that their territory was being invaded, that they no longer had absolute freedom of movement. For the first few weeks, there was no direct contact. Patrols found signs of the brothers' presence: newly abandoned camps, fresh footprints, the remains of still warm fires. It was as if Elijah and Silas were always one step ahead, always managing to dodge at the last moment. Some of the soldiers began to grow frustrated, thinking they were chasing ghosts, but Brennan maintained discipline, insisting that patience would prevail. In mid-July, the first real confrontation occurred. A 5-man patrol was investigating reports of smoke in a remote area when they came across one of the brothers' camps. This time, however, the camp wasn't abandoned. Elias and Silas were there, working on the hides of animals they had hunted. When they saw the soldiers approaching, they didn't immediately flee as expected. Instead, they stood still, watching, assessing. The patrol sergeant in charge, a man named Thomas Hayes, ordered the two to surrender. There was a tense moment of silence. The soldiers had their guns drawn. The brothers were apparently unarmed, at least with no visible firearms. Then Silas, recognizable by a small scar above his left eyebrow, spoke. He said they had committed no crime, that they were simply living as free men in the mountains, hunting and fending for themselves. Hayes wasn't fooled by the calm tone. He advanced with 2 soldiers to make the arrest, while the other 3 maintained cover. That's when everything happened so quickly. The brothers moved with surprising speed, separating in opposite directions and disappearing into the dense vegetation before the soldiers could react properly. Shots were fired, but to no avail. In a matter of seconds, Elias and Silas had vanished into the forest as if they had never been there. The patrol attempted to pursue, but quickly found themselves in dangerous territory, with limited visibility and multiple escape routes available to the fugitives. Hayes, remembering Brennan's instructions not to be led into traps, ordered them back to base camp. He knew the brothers could easily be leading them into an ambush, separating the group on favorable ground. When Brennan learned of the encounter, he was simultaneously frustrated and encouraged. Frustrated because the capture opportunity had been missed, but encouraged because he now knew the brothers were under enough pressure to make mistakes. The fact that they didn't flee immediately upon seeing the patrol suggested overconfidence or perhaps desperation. Either way, they were signs that the strategy was working. Brennan stepped up operations. More patrols, more outposts, a greater presence in the mountains. He also began using counterintelligence tactics, spreading false information about troop movements, creating deceptive patterns, trying to anticipate where the brothers might be and setting ambushes there. It was a complex game of cat and mouse, played out across miles of dense forest and rugged terrain. During this period, something interesting began to happen. Locals who had previously been afraid to speak out began volunteering information. With the visible military presence, they felt safer sharing their knowledge. A farmer revealed that the brothers occasionally traded on his isolated property, exchanging furs for basic supplies. A woman who ran a small tavern at a crossroads admitted that they appeared there a few times a year. An elderly trapper told of a large cave the brothers used as a winter store. Every bit of information was valuable. Brennan began to build a mental map of the brothers' operations, identifying their patterns, their hiding places, their preferred routes. He realized that despite appearing unpredictable, Elias and Silas actually followed certain routines. They needed fresh water, so they frequented the same natural springs. They needed to hunt in areas where prey was abundant. They needed shelter during severe storms, which confined them to certain caves and rock formations. By early August, Brennan felt ready for a decisive operation. He had identified 3 caves that the brothers likely used as their main bases. His intention was to monitor all 3 simultaneously, waiting for the brothers to appear in one of them. Then, rather than attempting to capture them immediately, he would follow them discreetly, mapping the entire extent of their territory and locating any other hiding places they might have. It was an ambitious plan that required precise coordination and absolute discipline. The soldiers were divided into 3 groups of 6 men each, with the remaining 2 serving as messengers between the groups. Each team received detailed instructions on how to observe undetected, how to communicate through agreed-upon signals, and most importantly, how not to act rashly even if they had an apparent opportunity for capture. The operation began on a Monday morning. With clear skies and pleasant temperatures, the 3 groups positioned themselves discreetly near their designated caves, hidden in observation points that offered good visibility but were difficult to spot. And then, the waiting began. Hours dragged by under the hot August sun. The soldiers remained still, alert, resisting boredom and physical discomfort. It was the group observing the northernmost cave that got lucky first. Late in the afternoon of the second day, Elias appeared, alone, carrying a slaughtered deer on his shoulders. He entered the cave and didn't emerge for hours. The sergeant in charge sent a messenger to inform Brennan, who ordered them to continue observing and do nothing. He wanted to see if Silas would also appear, if there was a pattern to his movements. The next morning, Silas arrived, also carrying game. The two brothers were now together in the cave. Brennan made a bold decision. Instead of immediately surrounding the cave, he ordered half of the soldiers to remain on watch, while the other half discreetly investigated the surrounding area, searching for other hiding places, for stored supplies, for anything that might provide additional information about how the brothers operated. The investigation around the cave revealed much more than Brennan had anticipated. About 200 meters from the main entrance, hidden among rock formations covered in dense vegetation, the soldiers found what appeared to be a carefully organized storage area. There were tanned hides stacked and covered with waxed canvas to protect against moisture, hunting tools and traps in good condition, and several leather bags containing preserved supplies. But what really caught Brennan's attention were the personal items that clearly did not belong to the brothers. There were clothes of different sizes and styles, some men's, some women's, all carefully folded and stored. Pocket watches, some still working, others stopped at different times as if marking final moments. Bibles with names written on the opening pages, belongings families took with them on trips, small jewelry, and lockets with miniature portraits. It was a macabre collection, a silent inventory of lives cut short over the years. The soldiers also found documents, never-delivered letters, maps marked with routes travelers had planned to take. There were personal diaries, some with entries that ended abruptly mid-sentence, as if the writer had been interrupted and never had a chance to continue. Each item told a story, representing a person who had disappeared in those mountains, and now their physical memories were stored like trophies in a secret hiding place. Upon learning of the discovery, Brennan felt a mixture of satisfaction and horror. Satisfaction because he finally had concrete and abundant evidence of the brothers' crimes. Horror at the scale of what had been revealed. He ordered everything meticulously documented, each item catalogued and described. It would be crucial evidence in any future trial, but it would also serve to identify victims and perhaps bring some kind of closure to families who had lost loved ones without ever knowing what had happened to them. Meanwhile, surveillance of the cave continued. The brothers remained inside, seemingly unaware that their territory had been invaded, that their secrets were being exposed. Brennan now faced a difficult decision. He could order an immediate siege of the cave, attempting to capture the two while they were contained in a relatively small space. But caves were dangerous. They could have multiple exits, hidden tunnels, and narrow passages where an ambush would be easy. After carefully considering his options, Brennan decided to wait for the brothers to emerge. He positioned his men in a semicircle around the cave entrance, maintaining enough distance to remain undetected, but close enough to react quickly if necessary. The order was clear. When the brothers emerged, they would be confronted by superior forces and surrounded in such a way that escape would be impossible. If they attempted to resist, the soldiers were authorized to use whatever force was necessary to contain them. The wait stretched on for another full day. The sun rose and set, and there was still no movement in the cave. The soldiers remained in their positions, discreetly rotating, keeping constant watch. Some began to wonder if the brothers knew they were being watched, if there was some secret exit through which they had already escaped. But Brennan trusted his strategy and maintained the group's discipline. It was on the morning of the fourth day of surveillance that there was finally movement. Silas emerged first, stretching in the morning sun, seemingly relaxed and unprepared. He walked a few feet out of the cave, scanned the sky, then turned as if to call his brother. It was at that moment that Brennan gave the signal. The soldiers emerged from their positions, rifles raised, forming a tight semicircle around the cave entrance. Brennan stepped forward, his firm, authoritative voice echoing off the rocks. "Elijah and Silas, you are surrounded by authorized Tennessee Territorial Militia. Surrender immediately and you will not be harmed. Resistance will result in the use of force." For a moment that seemed to stretch forever, Silas simply stood there, assessing the situation. His eyes darted around, counting soldiers, measuring distances, calculating possibilities. Then Elijah appeared at the cave entrance behind him. The two brothers exchanged a look, and in that look there seemed to be complete communication, a decision made without words. To everyone's surprise, they slowly raised their hands in a gesture of surrender. There was no defiance in their expressions, none of the panic of cornered men. There was only a calm, almost resigned acceptance, as if they had always known this moment would eventually arrive. The soldiers advanced cautiously, keeping their weapons pointed, and applied irons to the brothers' wrists. They didn't resist, didn't try to escape, simply allowing themselves to be handcuffed and searched. The magazine revealed that both men carried long hunting knives, sharp and clearly well-maintained, but there were no firearms in their immediate possession. When questioned about this, Silas simply remarked that they had no need for rifles, preferring quieter methods. It was a chilling statement in its simplicity, a veiled admission that their effectiveness as predators depended not on technology, but on sheer skill. The journey back to Jonesboro took 3 days. Brennan didn't want to take any risks, so he kept the brothers under constant surveillance with at least 6 soldiers always on guard. They camped in open areas, kept the prisoners tied up at night, and took every conceivable precaution. But the brothers remained calm and cooperative, almost indifferent to their situation. They ate when offered food, slept when it was dark, and rarely spoke to each other or the guards. Their arrival in Jonesboro caused a sensation. News of their capture had spread, and a crowd was waiting to see the infamous Mountain Brothers. People who had lost family members, merchants who had been intimidated, entire families who had lived in fear for years, all wanted to witness this moment. There were shouts, accusations hurled from the crowd, some demanding immediate justice, others simply wanting to see the faces of those who had haunted the region for so long. Elias and Silas were taken directly to the local jail, a solid log building with iron bars on the windows. They were placed in separate cells, a precaution to prevent them from planning a joint escape. Armed guards were posted in constant shifts. Whitfield, finally seeing the culmination of years of work, immediately began preparing the case for trial. The objects found in the brothers' hideout were transported to Jonesboro and displayed as evidence. Families were invited to examine the belongings, trying to identify items that might have belonged to their missing loved ones. It was a painful but necessary process. One man recognized the pocket watch of his brother, who had disappeared 4 years earlier. A woman identified the shawl her sister wore when she left for the West and was never seen again. Each identification was further confirmation of the extent of the brothers' crimes. Whitfield also began collecting formal testimony. Caldwell and the caravan survivors provided detailed statements. Rebecca Thornton, the merchant, testified about the brothers' strange purchases and disturbing behavior. Dutch Wagner recounted his encounter in the cave during the blizzard. Samuel Garrett offered his diary entries as documentary evidence. Gradually, a complete picture began to emerge, not just of individual crimes, but of a systematic pattern that had lasted for years. But Whitfield faced a significant problem. Most of the evidence was circumstantial. They had missing persons' belongings, they had testimonies of suspicious behavior and intimidation, but they had no bodies, and they had no eyewitnesses to actual homicides. In an era where the law required concrete evidence for capital convictions, this could be an insurmountable obstacle. The brothers could claim they simply found these objects abandoned in the mountains, that they had no knowledge of what had happened to their original owners. Whitfield knew he needed more. He needed a confession, or he needed incontrovertible physical evidence. And it was with this goal in mind that he began interrogating the brothers personally, trying to find cracks in their calm facades, trying to elicit admissions that might seal their convictions. But what he would discover during these interrogations would deeply disturb him and reveal aspects of human psychology that the small community of Jonesboro had never encountered before. The interrogations began on a hot August afternoon in the back room of the Jonesboro courthouse. Whitfield decided to question the brothers separately, hoping the separation might create anxiety or lead one of them to contradict the other. He started with Silas, who seemed slightly more communicative of the two, though this impression was based on minimal observation. Silas was brought in handcuffed by 2 guards and seated on a simple wooden chair. Whitfield stood on the other side of a rough table, paper and ink ready to record everything said. A local scribe was also present to create an official record. The room was lit by 2 small windows and an oil lamp, creating a somber atmosphere even in the middle of the afternoon. The judge began with basic questions about his name, age, and origins. Silas responded in a monotone voice, confirming that he and his brother were 19, that they had been born and raised in the mountains, and that their father had died a few years ago of natural causes. His answers were short, direct and devoid of emotion. It was like talking to someone who was merely fulfilling a necessary but uninteresting formality. When Whitfield began asking about the objects found in the cache, Silas didn't deny they were theirs. He said they had collected these items over the years, finding them on trails, in abandoned campsites, in places where travelers had left things behind. His explanation was plausible on the surface, but there was something about the way it was delivered that rang false, as if he were reciting a prepared story without caring whether it would be believed or not. Whitfield pressed. How did they explain that so many of these objects belonged to people who had been officially reported missing? Silas simply shrugged, a casual gesture that seemed completely disconnected from the gravity of the situation. He said the mountains were dangerous, that people got lost all the time, that bears and wolves were abundant, that deep gorges could swallow the careless. It wasn't their responsibility if inexperienced travelers took foolish risks. The judge changed tack, asking about specific encounters witnesses had reported. The Caldwell caravan, for example. Why had they chased and intimidated those people? Silas denied stalking anyone. He said they simply lived in the mountains and occasionally watched travelers pass by, which wasn't a crime. As for the feeling of being followed that the caravan members reported, well, people's imaginations could create many things when they were scared and far from civilization. It was a clever defense calculated to exploit gaps in the evidence. And Whitfield realized that without a confession, or more concrete physical evidence, it would be difficult to secure a conviction for the most serious crimes. He tried a different approach, appealing to any shred of conscience that might exist. He spoke of the families who had lost loved ones, of the pain of uncertainty, of how an honest admission could at least bring some closure to those who suffered. Silas watched him with those empty eyes throughout the emotional appeal. When Whitfield finished, there was a long silence. Then Silas spoke, and what he said revealed something deeply disturbing about his nature. He said he didn't understand why people clung so tightly to the dead, why they wasted energy on mourning and memory. In the forest, he said, death was simply part of the natural cycle. One animal hunted another, a predator took prey, and life went on. There was no sentimentality, no moral weight. It was simply the reality of existence. The coldness of these words, the complete lack of empathy they revealed, left Whitfield visibly disturbed. He was dealing not just with criminals, but with individuals whose psychology was fundamentally different from most people's. They didn't view their actions through a moral lens. For them it was simply survival, the exercise of power in a land where power was the only law that mattered. Elias's interrogation, conducted the next day, was even more revealing in its brevity. Elias spoke even less than his brother. His answers were monosyllabic when possible, prolonged silences when not. But there were moments when his eyes lit up with something that could be interpreted as amusement, as if this whole cool performance were a tedious but occasionally entertaining game. When pressed about specific crimes, Elias simply denied knowledge. No, he knew nothing about missing explorers. No, he had never attacked bounty hunters. No, he had no idea how those personal items had ended up in his hideout. His denial was so absolute and dispassionate that it had its own perverse form of credibility. It was impossible to break someone who genuinely didn't seem to care about the consequences of their words. Whitfield tried to pit one brother against the other, suggesting that Silas had said things that implicated Elias more directly. But Elias simply smiled, a small cold smile, and said the magistrate would need to do better than that. They had grown up together, survived together, and nothing Whitfield could say could create a rift between them. The loyalty between the brothers was absolute, a bond forged through years of isolation and shared activity. Frustrated but not defeated, Whitfield decided to change his strategy once again. He organized a reenactment, taking the brothers under heavy guard back into the mountains to show them where certain events had occurred. The hope was that, confronted with specific locations, perhaps their memories would be triggered, perhaps they would inadvertently reveal something. It was a risky tactic taking them back to their territory, but Brennan assured them he had enough soldiers to prevent any escape attempts. The expedition set out on a foggy September morning. 20 soldiers surrounded the brothers, who were chained together but able to walk. They headed to the area where the explorers' camp had been found years before, then to the ravine where the disturbing evidence had been found, and finally to several other locations where disappearances had been reported. What Whitfield noticed during this journey was frightening. As they traveled deeper into the mountains, the brothers seemed to transform. The passivity they had displayed in prison began to fade. They moved with more confidence, their eyes constantly scanning the terrain, and occasionally they exchanged glances that clearly communicated something. It was as if they were returning home, drawing strength from some deep connection to this place. At one point, near a distinctive rock formation, Silas stopped and looked around as if remembering something. Whitfield, hopeful that there might finally be an opening, asked what he was thinking. Silas hesitated, then said something that would be recorded and remembered by all present. He said that this place held memories, that the land itself held secrets that would never be fully revealed, that the mountains protected those who understood their nature. It was an enigmatic statement, but one loaded with implication. Whitfield pressed, asking what kind of secrets. But Silas simply smiled and refused to elaborate. That brief moment of openness closed as quickly as it had appeared, and the brothers returned to their usual silence. The expedition returned to Jonesboro without having extracted a confession, but with renewed certainty that the brothers were guilty of far more than they could legally prove. Whitfield now faced the reality that he would have to build his case entirely on circumstantial evidence and testimony, without the satisfaction of an outright admission of guilt. Meanwhile, the community was growing restless. There was mounting pressure for the trial to proceed quickly. Some citizens, more impatient and vengeful, spoke openly of immediate justice, of resolving the issue without waiting for the slow processes of the law. Whitfield had to maintain extra guards not only to prevent the prisoners from escaping, but also to protect them from potential vigilante attacks. The trial was finally set for early October 1833. It would be held in the Jonesboro courthouse, with a jury of local men presided over by a traveling judge who had come from Knoxville especially for the case. Anticipation was enormous. People traveled from neighboring counties to watch, filling the small town to capacity. It was the most significant event the region had seen in years, perhaps decades. The night before the trial began, Whitfield reviewed his evidence one last time. He had compelling testimony, physical objects linking the brothers to missing victims, and documented patterns of suspicious behavior. But he had no bodies, no witnesses to actual homicides, and no confessions. Would it be enough to convince 12 men beyond a reasonable doubt? He wasn't sure. What he was certain of was that, regardless of the outcome of the trial, the story of Elijah and Silas had already left a permanent mark on that region. The Appalachian Mountains would always be remembered as a place of beauty, but also of hidden danger. And the names of those two brothers, even if eventually erased from official records, would live on in the memories and stories whispered around campfires for generations to come. The trial began on a cold October morning, with the Jonesboro courthouse packed long before the scheduled time. People crowded the hallways, the windows, and the outside of the building, all eager to witness this historic moment. Judge Cornelius Hammond, a middle-aged man with a reputation for rigor and impartiality, took his place on the raised bench, surveying the crowd with a stern gaze that demanded order and respect. Elias and Silas were brought in chains, escorted by 6 armed guards. For the first time in weeks, the two were in the same room together, and the connection between them was palpable. They sat side by side at the defendant's table, their expressions maintaining that mask of calm indifference that so disturbed those who watched them. Their eyes, however, occasionally swept the room, assessing faces, counting weapons, measuring distances, as if even there, surrounded by dozens of witnesses and under constant surveillance, they were calculating possibilities. The jury selection process took nearly a full day. Whitfield wanted men who could be impartial, but also understood the realities of mountain life. The defense attorney, a man named Richard Pemberton, who had been appointed by the court because the brothers lacked the resources to hire legal representation, sought jurors who valued concrete evidence over hearsay and fear. Eventually, 12 men were chosen, farmers, merchants, and artisans, all from the region, all aware of the brothers' reputation, but swearing to judge solely on the basis of what was presented in court. Whitfield opened with a powerful script. He described years of terror in the mountains, spoke of families torn apart by the inexplicable loss of loved ones, and painted a picture of 2 human predators who had transformed one of Tennessee's most beautiful regions into a land of fear. He promised the jury that, through evidence and testimony, he would prove beyond a doubt that Elias and Silas were responsible for multiple murders, robberies, and intimidations over several years. Pemberton, in his opening defense, took a different approach. He admitted that his clients were strange men who lived unconventionally, perhaps frightening to people unfamiliar with the rustic ways of the frontier. But living differently was not a crime. He argued that the charge hinged on circumstances, assumptions, and the collective fear of a community eager to find scapegoats for tragedies that could have far more mundane explanations. People got lost in the mountains, were attacked by wild animals, succumbed to the elements. Attributing all these deaths to two men without direct evidence would be unfair and dangerous. The following days were filled with testimony. Caldwell recounted his caravan's harrowing experience, describing how the brothers had stalked and intimidated them, and how two men in their group had disappeared and were never found. Rebecca Thornton testified about the strange purchases and disturbing behavior. Dutch Wagner told his story of hiding in the cave, listening to the brothers discuss their activities with disconcerting coldness. Samuel Garrett presented his diary, with dated entries documenting encounters over the years. Families of the missing identified objects found in the brothers' hiding place, their voices breaking with emotion as they recognized belongings of loved ones who had left and never returned. Captain Brennan testified about the discovery of the macabre cache, about the trophy collection that clearly represented years of criminal activity. Each testimony added another layer to the prosecution's case, building a mosaic of evidence that, while circumstantial, was impressive in its volume and consistency. Whitfield also presented maps showing patterns of disappearances, all concentrated in the area where the brothers operated. He presented fragmentary official records, letters from desperate families, and petitions from communities asking for protection. Pemberton did his best with a tough defense. He questioned witnesses about their certainties, pointed out minor inconsistencies in their accounts, and suggested alternative explanations for the events described. He argued that personal belongings could indeed have been found abandoned, that the brothers' presence near disappearance sites did not prove they had caused those disappearances. He repeatedly reminded the jury that there were no bodies, no murder weapons, and no eyewitnesses to capital crimes. The brothers never testified in their own defense. Pemberton advised them against it, fearing that their lack of emotion and cold responses would further damage their case. So they sat silently throughout the trial, watching the proceedings with that same impenetrable expression, as if it were all just a tedious spectacle they had to endure. After 5 days of testimony, it was time for the closing arguments. Whitfield made an impassioned plea for justice, not just for the known victims, but for all the people who had disappeared in those mountains over the years. He argued that the absence of bodies was in itself evidence of the sophistication of the crimes, that the brothers knew the territory well enough to ensure their victims would never be found. He urged the jury to look at the complete pattern, the totality of the evidence, and reach the only logical conclusion possible. Pemberton, in his closing argument, appealed to fundamental principles of the law. He argued that no matter how disturbing the defendants, no matter how suspicious the circumstances, the law required proof beyond a reasonable doubt. He argued that the prosecution had not met this standard, that building a case based on fear and assumption was a betrayal of the principles of justice. He urged the jury to have the courage to acquit, even knowing it would be an unpopular decision. The jury retired to deliberate late on a Saturday afternoon. Hours passed as the community waited anxiously. Night fell, lamps were lit, and still no verdict was reached. Some began to fear that the jury was divided, that they might not reach a consensus. But on Sunday morning, after nearly 16 hours of deliberation, the 12 men returned to the courtroom. Judge Hammond asked if they had reached a verdict. The jury foreman, a respected farmer named Abraham Yates, stood and confirmed that they had. The tension in the room was almost unbearable. Families of victims held each other's hands. Whitfield kept his face impassive, but his hands were clenched under the table. The brothers remained as usual, indifferent, as if the outcome didn't affect them in any way. The verdict was read: guilty. Guilty on multiple counts of murder, robbery, and conspiracy. A collective sigh ran through the courtroom, a mixture of relief, satisfaction, and perhaps a touch of sadness at the confirmation of so much evil. Judge Hammond thanked the jury for their service and set sentencing for the following day. On Monday morning, the court reconvened for sentencing. Judge Hammond spoke at length about the nature of the crimes, the terror inflicted on the region, and the need for justice not only to punish but also to protect the community. He sentenced both brothers to death by hanging, to be carried out within 30 days. News of the sentence spread quickly throughout the region. For many, it was the necessary closure of a dark chapter. But there were also those who felt something important remained unexplained. How many victims had actually been? Where were their remains? What deep-seated motivations had driven two young brothers to become what they did? The days before the execution were strange. The brothers maintained their characteristic silence, refusing visits from clergymen who tried to offer spiritual comfort or extract final confessions. They ate little, slept when they wanted, and occasionally spoke to each other in voices too low for the guards to hear. There was something unsettling about their calm acceptance of the fate that awaited them. The execution was scheduled for a Tuesday in November, on a freezing morning that foreshadowed the coming winter. A huge crowd gathered, not out of bloodlust, but because it was the custom of the time to witness justice being meted out. The gallows had been erected in an open area on the outskirts of Jonesboro, a simple but functional structure. Elijah and Silas were brought together, their chains removed only in the final moments. They climbed the steps to the gallows with firm steps, without hesitation, without visible fear. The executioner asked if they had any last words. Silas looked at the gathered crowd, then at the distant mountains that could be seen on the horizon, and said simply, "The mountains hold more secrets than you will ever discover." Elijah said nothing, only nodded in agreement with his brother's words. The hoods were donned, the ropes adjusted, and in a moment that seemed suspended in time, the trapdoor opened. Frontier justice had been meted out. Two of the most disturbing criminals the region had ever known were dead, and their stories would immediately begin to become legend. In the years that followed, something curious happened. Official records about Elijah and Silas began to disappear or be deliberately obscured. Names were stricken from documents, files were lost, details were altered. It was as if there was a conscious effort to erase the complete memory of these two from official history, leaving only fragments, whispers, stories told in hushed tones. Some say it was shameful, that authorities didn't want to admit how long it had taken to bring the brothers to justice. How many victims could have been saved if they had acted sooner? Others suggest there were additional secrets, connections some people didn't want revealed, complicities they were more comfortable leaving buried alongside the brothers' bodies. What we know for sure is that the Appalachian Mountains remained dangerous long afterward. Travelers still disappeared occasionally, though less frequently. Communities remained vigilant, more cautious, more aware that the beauty of the place hid real dangers. And on winter evenings, when the wind howled between the peaks and shadows danced on the cabin walls, people still told stories of two brothers who knew every trail, every cave, every hiding place in the mountains, and who had turned that knowledge into something terrible. Today, more than 200 years later, the names of Elias and Silas are almost unknown outside of historical crime research circles. But their story remains a disturbing reminder that even in the most primitive societies, even in the most remote places, minds can emerge that operate completely outside normal moral parameters, and that sometimes the true monsters are not creatures of the imagination, but human beings who choose to live by their own dark rules. If this journey through the shadows of history has fascinated you, and you want to continue exploring the most disturbing and forgotten cases of the past, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Activate the bell so you don't miss any future investigations, and leave a comment with which dark story you'd like us to explore next. There are so many secrets buried in time, so many forgotten truths waiting to be revealed. Until the next investigation.